Hey, it's Dr. Bab. I am recording a supplemental video on this VPS assignment too. I want to clarify some of the things about data access with Python. If we go back to, I'll actually go back to my local machine, we can start up idle, and the command is python-m idle lib.idle, and that starts it up actually if you have your virtual environment going. So let me exit out of here, and so I'll have idle discontinued there, and I'll go ahead and say so those of you with a virtual environment that's on your VPS, you'd have to say, the name of your environment, bin activate, and then that's how that would go. But if you're here on Windows, which you're not going to be to run this, it's there inside lib, and it's called sorry, it's not in lib, it's in scripts, and it's called activate.bat. So here I would say dot slash, actually I don't have to say the dot part at all. I would say env slash scripts, or I can just put the full path. No, I can say dot slash env scripts slash activate dot bat, and that turns on the virtual environment. Now that I have the virtual environment running, the best way to start up idle so it uses the virtual environment is python -m idle lib dot idle. Now the question would be, why am I bothering to do this? I'm bothering to do this because you're going to need to test these scripts locally. So this kind of brings up a bit of a gotcha that I was under the illusion I had included in the previous videos, and I didn't. Let me teach you about, first of all, the part of this you're fulfilling is this metar part in addition to the script I wrote for you. What kind of table in MySQL should we do? And then what about the permissions and the user, right? So that's what we're trying to deal with. If you recall this metar script, let's go back to Python idle. You might recall that this metar script just effectively would read from these top airports here and dump it down into this text file. And of course, I was asked a reasonably good question, and the question was, and there it is working, grabbing all that data and putting it into the text file. But the assignment says to put it up into the database, and to which I say, yes, you are actually correct. So what about putting it in the database? Well, what do we really have? We really just have the text, right? Maybe what I could do is a timestamp, and that might actually stand in pretty well for an ID. So the idea would be, let's open up the Python shell here. So if I say date time, let's do this. Import from date time. No, I'm sorry. Import date time from date time. It just says bring this little part in from that library. No, I'm sorry. From date time, import date time. It says data time. Okay, I'm going to eventually get this right. From date time, import date time. Okay, good. So if I said date time dot now, date time dot now, we can get the current date. If I said print date time, print date time dot now, still do the same thing. So I could use that value as something that's reasonably a unique ID because it's got down to those fractions of seconds. So anytime the code runs, it'll be slightly different. So well, I'm going to break this down into the question is, well, how do I make sure this database part works? And this will answer several different questions in the project. Well, first of all, I don't have a table called METAR, and I'm going to use VATSIMData2 here. So going into VATSIMData2, you can see I'm in phpMyAdmin, and I went ahead and put this up here on my main server just to kind of show that point. Because I was showing some in my local server, so that could be reasonable doubt. Hey, is this stuff really working? So I'm going to create a table called METAR data, and I really just need 2 columns, one for the ID and one for the data itself. So I'll go. Now, one other thing a student brought up to me, and it was a good point, is sometimes the data is going to have funny stuff in it. So we'll call this timestamp. I'll call it time ID. Okay. And I'm not going to have an int. I'm just going to have it to be that string value. Even if it is a number, the string value we find. So I'm going to go ahead and call it varchar, and I'll just call it 255 to be safe. It's larger than it needs to be, but that's okay. And I'll call this METAR, and I could make it text. That would be very large, but it would also make it safer. So the other thing we want to do is to say, okay, well, what is this collation stuff? And the reason this is going to matter is it depends on whether we have funny characters in the data, for want of a better way to put it. So this UTF stuff you see, UTF-16, UTF-32, and UTF-8, UTF-8 is a safe way to make sure if you get other characters. Now, what's funny is you'll see Swedish here. Originally, MySQL was made by Swedish developers, so that actually becomes the default. It won't hurt because it's a language that uses the Latin 1 character set. So I'll do this as well. I'll come down here and select UTF-8. And the motivation for doing that is general would have been fine as well. But I'm just going to use the Swedish because it's the natural collation. So this has to do with what character set's being used. Okay, the other thing I could do is say that this is going to be the primary key. And we're going ahead and just making it clear that and we don't want to take nulls here. So as I collect this data, even if I'm doing it periodically, it'll send it over here. So if I say save this, oh, here we are. I'm saying allow nulls, and I actually don't want nulls. So that the checkbox says allow nulls, and I really actually don't want to have nulls. So having the UTF-8 is a good idea for some of this data you're collecting because funny characters can go into it. So for this part of the assignment on Sunday, I think this is sufficient. Okay, so what about writing to it? That's fine, but how do the next question you should rightfully ask is, how are you supposed to write to it? This code here will actually work. This code is more or less the basis of my other example. So this is from the W3 Schools reference material. So I'm not going to use it straight away. This code here is actually active and up and running on my server. But it doesn't incorporate the database stuff. So what I'll do is just save this stuff on a little notepad file so I can come back to it. So if we go to the command line here, we'd want to make sure that the MySQL connector works. But now we actually come to an important point, and here's the point. How do we know we're going to be able to get into the database from the script? There's a couple things. Embedded in the one-click install you did is the fact that it already allows the firewall that comes as standard in your install, your one-click install of Linux, is something called UFW. So sudo UFW status. Now in that set up your server guide, we actually went over this. What wasn't clear is that 3306 is available. Now, I didn't touch anything to this, but that's available. So I would have covered that in the server guide, but I didn't go the extra step to say, okay, but you really need to make sure that people can code, others can get in from the outside, basically. So what I'll do is, let me see if I have MySQL Workbench installed. If I'm lucky, I do. And I'm not lucky, so I'll have to pause and go back. That's not 1,000% necessary, but what I was going to show you is ways you can kind of confirm you can get into your database from outside of your server, which is really the part I was trying to avoid last time, and I think that's why I didn't end up recording it, but I think we're at that stage where I can't hide the truth from you. So if you do sudo UFW, I think it means ultimate firewall or something like that, status, you too should see those values there. That means I can get in from the outside. At least I'm permitted to out here. Now here's another unfortunate tiny detail, important detail that you're really going to have to go fix. Okay, so you want to go to change directory etc mysql. Then you want to go into change directory into MySQL conf, that thing there. See that, let's go up a level. Print working directory, we're in MySQL. Do a directory listing, that mysql.conf.d. D stands for daemon, DAEMON, which is just a term in the Unix world for an ongoing process. Let's go into that folder, just do a directory listing. And one of the files you see is mysqld.cnf. So then go to sudo nano mysqld.cnf. This is a security measure. It's done for your own good. You technically shouldn't have to do what I'm about to do. But if you want to minimize headaches so that you have less less hassle, this bind address, it says 127.0.0.1. This means that no matter what, no matter how much I wish it wasn't so or was so, there's no way I can talk to this database from the outside. The only way to be able to talk to it is from internal. Well, that's not horrible because I'm actually trying to only run internally. But here's the dirty secret. If you really want to be able to reach your database from the outside, as in from your desktop as you're scripting this, then put in bind address equals 0.0.0.0, which effectively means just connect from anywhere. I don't care. So the net effect here is, I'll undo the other one though, is so I've got both of them in there, is you can turn either on or off, where the comment turns it on and off. Now, of course, and you want to say yes, save it. The sudo part's important. You want to do it as the super user. And part of the instructions from the first video is go in and make sure you make an account. That's not just the root account. So the other thing you want to do, though, and again, this is a break glass in case of emergency thing. I'm trying to inform you so you have the most flexibility, the most latitude to do things. But now you want to do system control. Oh, I know why. Restart, and then and if you just hit tab, it's eventually going to pick up the MySQL service. Let me make that wider so you can see it all. So the point of these videos is to stop at this stage and, type that down, write it down. So this is going to restart MySQL. And now, had I have gone to the listen anywhere, it would have worked. Now, I do have a script that's running on here. The file should be really large by now. It's in... Oh, yeah, I didn't put it on the remote machine. Okay, let's do a second connection. Let me make that large so that you can see it well. Okay, so if I go to this VATSIM data, that file is getting larger and larger because since I last recorded that video the previous weekend, that's just been running every 5 minutes or 2 minutes, I can't remember what, and just going off and getting fresh information over and over and over again. So you want to kind of do the same thing and put this stuff up into the database table, which is what I asked for. So I'm going to move this script onto my main VPS out here, the same one like I made for the summer, and we can review even things like the sudo cron tab -e, which edits the cron tab, which is how you get the job in there, like we discussed previously. Okay, so for this cron tab, it's set to run every 15 minutes, and I go off and get fresh data for the weather for those 5 airports. So the question would be, okay, well, how could I write to the database on that? So let's just see how I have that set up on the machine that's here in my home. So the difference is this is the machine in the home, this is the remote server. So I guess the question is what's different? Let me go to change directory etc MySQL. Let me go into MySQL configuration, and let me go into sudo nano MySQL d.configuration and go down a bit, and you'll be able to see that I too did the same thing here. See what I just showed on my remote server? I just did the same thing. So I opened it up so it could be communicated from anywhere. Motivation is just to make things simpler. So on that note, what else needs to be set up? Okay, well, here's another thing needs to be set up. On the server, so I'm in the one here in my home now. I do have a VATSIM data. So on the server, if I go into VATSIM data here, and I still haven't collected new pilot information for a while, but if you go to privileges, you can see I have a user called VATSIM data. But highly important is the host name can come from anywhere. So let's go and set up the same thing here. So I have this METAR data here, but if I go to privileges, there's no other users. But look at this, add user account. So I don't want it to be called admin. I want to call it VATSIM data. And the any host here, the % is highly important. The password, you probably want to generate some kind of randomly strong password. Super duper important. Radically important. Very important. Very important. Pause and rewind this. Very important. Please save the database password. If you don't, my number one recommendation is going to be that, I'm sorry, what I mean by the database password is save that user's password, is to go in and just destroy the user and start over. Because recovering it's not worth the hassle. So now let's talk about some of these settings. I don't want to create a database with the same name because I already have a VetSim data database. I don't want to grant all the privileges for this person. I do want to grant some privileges to this person on VetSim data 2. But not really. I don't even have a VetSim data 2 in here as well. Well, that is, I don't have a table. So now global privileges I want to leave off. This require SSL stuff I want to leave off. So there is another page to go to though. And this says, what do you want them to be able to do on VetSim data 2? And that's for database specific privileges. Now, METAR data and VetSim client data 2 are tables inside that database. I would just leave them as is, but you definitely want high privileges on the database. Now, once you get more sophisticated and know what you're doing, you can be more narrow, but for this exercise, not. So now I have updated the privileges for this user. So that user should be able to write to VetSim data. So what about taking this and changing it? Okay, localhost is fine. In fact, let's open this up because we want to write. This is actually off there in the remote server. Let's go ahead and quickly work with the file that'll put all this together. So here's the remote server as well. And because this is the way I've been teaching you to do it, I'm going to go ahead and code this on idle. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to drop all this code that I had copied in. Heck, I'm even going to borrow the password there. And I'm going to save as, and just save it somewhere where I can get it again. So in VetSim data 2, I'm going to call it getmetar.py. Okay, perfect. So what do I got to change in this database code? Well, first of all, do I have a project folder? And the answer is no. So make directory VetSim data 2. All right. Change directory into VetSim data 2. And what about making a virtual environment? Well, first of all, let's see if Python's on here. It is. It's not super up to date, but it'll do. So Python 3 module venv or env, just like the other instructions we've seen. So that'll make a virtual environment. Of course, granted that I have it installed, which we went through. Okay, and that has to be sudo, which we went through in a previous, all these steps are something I went through in a previous installation of these videos. Okay, so let's make the virtual environment. Then we'll do pip3 install. Well, first of all, let's activate it so that when we install something, it's installed there. So this will be source.env bin activate. Now it's activated. Pip 3 install requests pip3 install MySQL dot connector. Might be a dash in between it. Yep. So, no, don't worry about that wheel stuff. See, it says successfully installed connector. That's all you have to care about. Okay. So, now that we're in VATSIM data 2, I can go to FileZilla later and open up. There's VATSIM data 2. There's get metar. So I can drag that over when I'm done. So I'm going to show you a slightly different flow. I'm going to not test it too much here locally. But by the time I'm done, this is something you can just copy paste from. So let's try to get a little bit of test data here. So localhost is fine. User is, if you recall from us working on the web, user was, let's look at the privileges, VATSIM data. Password is this one I was emphatic about you saving. And I'm doing this differently than I did it in the code I wrote for you to take the pilot data and put it up into the tables. I'm doing this to where it's a lot simpler, basically, is what I'm trying to say. VATSIM data 2, the user's VATSIM. And then we're just pretty much ready. What's the name of our table? Metar data. And then we have this thing that puts together some values. I'm going to put together the values slightly different, though. I'm going to say date. What did I call it? Time ID. Time ID equals, and let's not forget to do this other part, from date time import date time, just like you saw me do. Time ID equals date time dot now. All right. Then we want to insert into that. What's the name of our two fields? You can see them on the left there. It's time ID up here. You can see them. Time ID and metar. And then here we want this to be time ID. I might have to make that a string. And then here I'll just say, well, the heck with it. Let's go pull some metar out. No. No. Yes. Let's run this, which will grab some metar, and I'll just copy paste one of these. Perfect. Let's copy paste that. I think I can copy it. Yep. So for this on the fly script, I'll put that data in. So that it'll execute it, it'll commit to the database. It should say it inserted something. So I'll save this. By the time I'm done, this will be doctored up so it just works and you can use it. but the how to connect part is what I'm covering. So I'll save this, and then over to FileZilla, I'll drag get metar in there. Then back on the server, there's get metar. Python 3 get metar. One record inserted. See that? Let's see if that's a lie. Look at that. You see it in there? All right. Let me do it again for ye of little faith. Because this is the far simpler way of doing it. So I would say there's a little bit of engineering, if you will, in the version I made that I encourage you all to use. There's the time ID. So I know it's a string representation of the time, but it does the job, right? It's a unique value. Those fractions a second are going to do the job. So let's go back to the script. And I'm going to edit it. No, wrong script. I'm going to edit it back on the machine. And by that I mean back on my desktop. Paste that in. Let me make this wider so we don't all get too lost. Save it. Go back over to FileZilla. Drag it over. Going to say something to the effect of, do you want to overwrite it? I'm going to say yes, sir. Then Python 3 get metar. One record inserted. Browse. 2 records. Right here. So this begs the question. And if I were mean, I would say, now go figure it out. But I realize this is, for some students, a lot of new material. But how do I incorporate those together? Well, let's investigate it by looking at these side by side. Here they are side by side. Okay, so I certainly need to connect to the database. So will do. And let's go ahead and pull this over as well. So let's get it so that it's ready to start being used. So every time I edit, I know I can work with it. So I need the database stuff, but I don't need to do it over and over again. So that stuff can go up here. Okay, great. What else did I do over there? I got that time now thing. First of all, I need this cursor. What that does is it gives you the ability to move through records as you read them. I need the time ID code as well. But what's interesting is I need the time ID every time I get a new station. So that's going to go down in here. Then I need all of this. And it needs to go each and every time I was writing down to that script. In fact, I'll just put it here. I'll write to the database, then I'll write to the file. That'll work just fine. So here we say time ID and metar. So that's inside response. You see how response text? We got it up here. So I'm going to use response text instead of hard coding the metar. Because this is what was coming back from the query from the web. Read it from the web. What time is it now? That was just when I was showing you guys how to slow things down if you had to. Here's the data to put together for this SQL statement. Insert into metar data is the name of the table. The 2 fields you want to write to is time ID and metar. The values are, and those 2 placeholders are there so that you can insert the required values. And it's to prevent dependency injection. And I embarrassingly cannot conjure up, as I speak to you, the proper name for that process, but it's parameterized queries is I guess the term, I think. Parameterization. So then here my cursor.execute will write off to the database. That actually, just like we close the file, in fact, it does the same thing. In fact, these are highly equivalent, folks. My cursor execute is the same thing as fwrite in terms of what it's doing. One writes to the database, one writes to the file. This is almost the same thing as closing the file. It says, I'm done. Here we say one record was inserted. Here we show it to the screen. So this is what it means to combine the two. The only thing we want to do differently, though, that I probably could have done better over in this code here, is we ultimately want to close the connection, right? So here outside of the script, outside of the loop, I should say, we want to mydb.close, because that will, like we've closed the file, it'll close the connection. But we don't want to close the connection inside the loop to the database. So it's a slight difference between opening and closing files and opening and closing the database connection. So this guy here, of course, let's test it. Let's test here by seeing, is there any redundancy to closing it? In this case, because the script just dies out, it's kind of redundant to close it. But since we were in a loop here, it's a good idea to close it. So here, I'm going to go ahead and drag both files over. Should get an overwrite. Yep. Go back to the script. Okay, so let's do get metar first. Okay, so it still does the database just fine. So let's do main. Okay, so drum roll, because this is a little bit more involved. And I have a problem. The problem is... Aha. Do you see it? I don't define the correct imports. I had some imports in here that I didn't put in there. Let's drag these two guys over. Look at that. Now, what does that mean for the database? Let's browse again. Now there's that many records. What about making this a job? Actually, now this is going to go on every 15 minutes. I already made this a job. So those are some updates. Let's just review. How to structure the metar table, done. Table in MySQL, done. Permissions, sudo ufw, status. Can I get in? Yes. What I'm looking for, by the way, if I wasn't specific before, port 3306. I'm going to resist the temptation to drop into a networking protocol discussion here. We'll just sort of say that is the door that allows scripts to talk. Now, you're not even coming from outside with this. User, yes. Under VATSIM data 2, privileges, add user account. Then don't forget, in the privileges, we set up only database-specific privileges. Python code, done. We just went through that together. Specifically, all this code. What I've done is demonstrated writing one record just independently, and then I turned around and showed how to modify the script from previous to show how to do all the records. So, this here is what you want to probably pause the video on, so you can drag it off to one side of your screen and copy out the code I'm writing. All of this would work, but you have to, of course, put it down into your location. So the get metar was the one-off I was showing you, but the main.text. Now this is still going to be writing out here. Well, actually, there's one exception. I actually don't have this jobbed out yet. Let's copy from this job. By jobbed, I mean running as a regular process in cron. So here's at the bottom of the screen, sudo cron tab -e. Now I do it as sudo because it gives you the highest likelihood that this is going to run properly. And in this case, you notice that the folder is called vetsimdata2. So sudo cron tab -e. I want to use nano. Cool. Here, */15. What does that mean? It means that I'm just going to do this every 15 minutes, not pegged to any one time. And so from the time the script runs, every 15 minutes thereafter, which is good enough. Now for the pilot stuff, don't forget, I would suggest it really be 2. But we already discussed some of the dangers there. So now you need the relative path. Well, not relative, this is an absolute path to where this script is. Now, it's not home Jeff for you guys. That's important. It's home / whatever user you're using. Back in the how to set up your server video from the first VPS video I made, I go to that part of DigitalOcean's tutorials and say, hey, here's some last steps you should take to set up your server. main.py. Okay, so this we'll put in the new job. But what it won't do is one last thing you want to do, rather, is to do this system control restart, and then you want to restart the cron process. Okay, great. Because what it's upset about is saying, look, there's more than one thing called CR. Now, that should do it. Now, one last thing, though. Even though I said set up a virtual environment, it's a little bit beyond scope for me to make sure you have a good virtual environment set up so that cron runs against it. So let me do the last little bit, and then we'll cut this video out. So sudo, we don't actually need to sudo it. Let's say source env bin. Never mind, you don't have to do that. You just have to say the word deactivate. Sorry, because you already have the environment going. Okay, so last thing you probably want to do sudo pip3 install requests. This is going to install it globally. Oh, that's right. Hold on. Maybe it's not pip3. Sudo apt get. Oh yeah, and the reason we don't have pip3 on here is the same reason we didn't before. Because we had made that virtual environment. we made the virtual environment, and that's why it was upset. Because watch this. If we say source env bin activate, and then we say pip3, you can see it's happy as a clam. We get out of there by saying deactivate. Then we say Python 3. Let's try it this way. Well, how about we just do pip and see what version it is? All right, so what I had to do is install it real quick. It went into my virtual environment just fine, but it didn't go into the main environment. But what I'm driving at is a reasonable chance this fails to run if you don't have requests and the MySQL connector on there. So my other script ran just fine because it was only requiring basic built-in capabilities of Python. But if I want to have requests in there, that's a different story. So I don't know if you noticed the nuance. Go back and rewind this part of the video, but I actually had to put normal pip on before I could put pip3 on. So this all has to do with the one-click bundle you selected. So this is the other reason why it's nice to have virtual environments. But the point is to get your script to activate the virtual environment is difficult because we're having to rely on our scripts being in Python to begin with. So now if I say pip3, it'll run. But here's our issue. If we install requests, we're installing requests globally. And you might think like, okay, whoop-de-doo, why is that an issue? It's an issue because, and I'm installing MySQL connector. It's an issue because now you're having to rely on something globally. But in any case, like I said, there's a good chance at the end of the day you kind of don't care. So now if I say Python 3 get metar, it will go off and insert that one record. And if I say Python 3 main.py, it'll go off and get 10 records. Okay, so it works from the command line, but now that I have all this stuff in there, it'll work from the cron job as well. What I mean by I shouldn't speak so imprecisely. Now that I've installed all those dependencies, which is pip, pip3. So let's kind of recap with that. Pip. So what I did was I said sudo apt, really should say apt-get, but let's just say apt install pip sudo apt install pip. It was called Python pip Python 3 pip pip3 install requests pip3 install MySQL connector. Each of these lowercase. So what I'm doing here is just trying to quickly remind you, because I'll upload this, I'll amend this, I'll update it, but I'm trying to remind you when you sit down and try to work with what I'm sharing here remind you of these commands. So this runs now, or to put it differently, this should run. Now, last thing, what do you do if something doesn't run? I would actually run it like every minute to start with to make sure it really runs, because you're going to have to rely on some logging, which I don't want to get into. So if it doesn't run, the trick is to run it manually before you ever rely on running it automatically or scheduled. So you notice how I said Python 3 get metar. If it runs there, it'll run scripted just fine. Same deal here. Metars. I'm sorry, main. If it runs here, it'll run scripted just fine. Okay. I didn't mean to make a 3 hour-long video, but that's how it went. But these are some important tips, and these tips are going to sustain you through this weekend's video, which will be the last of the acutely technical videos. And we, in many ways, only have to review this stuff about writing off to the database when we pull stuff from API script calls. All right, hopefully this is helpful. Rewind parts of this if some of it doesn't make sense, but this is, I apologize, a couple of missing pieces from earlier. So now all of this should be pretty complete, and I will update the description. As always, if you need a little extra time, just ask. I've said on a case-by-case basis, I'll grant that. Thanks for your attention. I'll talk to you soon.